She came to Black Creek in a wheelchair, with a toolbox in her lap, and nothing else worth mentioning. The rancher who'd sent for her took one look, one long, terrible look, and said in front of every soul in that frozen town square, "I can't use a woman like that." He didn't lower his voice. He didn't look ashamed. He just turned around and walked away. And the crowd stood there watching like she was some kind of mistake that had rolled off the back of a supply wagon. Naomi Hartwell was 26 years old, 700 miles from home, and completely alone. What happened next is the kind of story people in Black Creek still talk about, because nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw her coming. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me all the way to the end, because I promise you, this one doesn't go where you think it's going. The stage line from Billings ran twice a week in winter, weather permitting, and it had not been permitted for the last 11 days. Naomi knew this because she'd spent 11 days in a way station 40 miles east of Black Creek, sleeping on a cot near the wood stove, listening to the wind work itself into a fury against the walls. The station master, a soft-spoken man named Arlo who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco, had looked at her wheelchair the first morning and said carefully, "Miss, the road west gets rough." "I know," she said. "I mean real rough. Ruts freeze solid. Stage gets to rocking." "I've been on worse," she told him, which was not entirely true, but she'd said it with enough flatness that he'd let it go. She used those 11 days the way she used most waiting. She worked. Arlo's stove had a cracked firebox door that let cold air bleed in around the hinge, and she fixed it with a strip of iron she found in his supply shed and a borrowed hammer. She tightened 3 loose window frames that had been rattling since autumn. She rewired the pulley system on his well cover so it stopped jamming halfway up. Arlo watched all of this with the careful, non-committal expression of a man who didn't want to be caught staring and also couldn't stop. On the 4th day, he said, "Where'd you learn all that?" "My father," Naomi said, without looking up from the bolt she was threading. "He was a millwright, bridges mostly, sometimes buildings. I was the only one of his children who wanted to follow him around." "He teach you?" "He didn't teach me so much as he let me watch. And then he'd walk away and I'd try it myself, and he'd come back and tell me what I did wrong." She paused, tested the bolt. "He died when I was 19. I kept doing it." She didn't add the rest. She didn't say, "After the accident, when I couldn't do anything else, the tools were still there." She didn't explain the 2 years of learning to work from a seated position, of building modified braces and clamps so her hands could do what her legs no longer could. Some things didn't need saying to strangers. On the 12th morning, the stage ran. She had found the advertisement in a Billings newspaper, folded into the pocket of a coat she'd bought secondhand. Someone had circled it in pencil, and she'd never been sure whether that was fate or coincidence, and had decided it didn't matter either way. Seeking a capable woman of sound character for Frontier Homestead Partnership. Black Creek, Wyoming Territory. Rancher Elias Holt, established 5 years, cattle and some farming. Right to box 14. She'd written. He'd written back. 3 letters over 2 months, each one businesslike and direct, which she'd appreciated. He'd asked about her practical skills, her health, her willingness to endure frontier conditions. She'd answered honestly about all of it, or almost all of it. She had told him about the wheelchair in the second letter in plain language, 2 sentences. The way she'd learned to do it, not apologetically, not with excessive explanation, just stated as a fact alongside the other facts. He had not responded to those 2 sentences directly. He had continued to the next topic. She had told herself that meant acceptance. She understood now that it had meant something else. But Black Creek in January was the color of old pewter. The mountains behind it disappeared into cloud, and the town itself. 3 main streets, maybe 60 buildings, a church at the north end, and a livery at the south, looked like it had been set down by someone who wasn't sure they were staying. The stage pulled in just past noon, and the cold hit Naomi like a door swung open into her face when they unlocked the coach. Getting down from a stage was always the worst part. There was no graceful version of it. The driver and the other passenger, a wool merchant from Casper who had not spoken to her once in 40 miles, both stood at a slight remove while she maneuvered herself to the door, lowered the chair with the rope harness she'd rigged along the exterior, and descended the metal step in a way that required complete concentration and no small amount of arm strength. She had done it dozens of times. She did it efficiently. She did not ask for help, and nobody offered it, which was the usual arrangement. The chair's wheels hit frozen ground, and she settled herself, adjusted her coat, and looked up. The square in front of the stage depot was not empty. It was, in fact, uncomfortably populated. Maybe 20 people, which for a town this size probably represented a significant portion of the population, gathered in the loose, casual way of people who happened to be there for various reasons and had simply not left. A few women outside the general store, some men near the livery, a group of children pressed against a fence, and one man standing directly in front of the depot, arms crossed over his sheepskin coat, hat pulled low, tall, somewhere past 40, with the sunburned neck of a man who worked cattle and the expression of someone who had already made a decision before anyone spoke. Naomi wheeled toward him. She could tell immediately, the way you can tell certain things in the first 3 seconds of seeing a person, that something was wrong. He wasn't watching her with recognition or even wariness. He was watching her with the fixed look of a man preparing to say something he considered necessary. "Mr. Holt," she said. She stopped about 6 feet from him because the ground between them had a ridge of frozen mud, and she didn't want to tip and lose whatever dignity she had left to lose. "You're the one who wrote," he said. Not a question. "Naomi Hartwell, yes." He looked at her. Not at her face, not with any particular hostility, just looked, the way a man looks at a horse that's been described to him one way and arrived looking another. Then he looked at the chair. Then he looked past her at the stage as if there might be someone else coming. "You said you were in good health." "I am in good health." "You didn't say—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. Around them, she was acutely aware of the stillness that had settled over the square, of the way the conversations nearby had gone quiet in that particular way that meant people were listening without appearing to. "I did say," Naomi told him, and she kept her voice level because going to pieces in front of strangers was not something she was willing to do. "Second letter. I was clear about it. You wrote you had a difficulty with your legs. I thought—" He exhaled through his nose. "I thought it meant something else." "What did you think it meant?" "I don't know, not this." He uncrossed his arms and looked down at her, and in his expression she could see the specific discomfort of a man who wasn't trying to be cruel, but was being cruel anyway, because he'd run out of better options. "Miss Hartwell, I run a working cattle operation. I need someone who's able to—" "Do you have a list?" Naomi asked. He blinked. "What?" "A list of what you need. Tasks. I'd like to hear it." Something shifted in his face, and she recognized it, irritation replacing discomfort, which was at least a simpler thing. "I can't take you on," he said bluntly. "I'm sorry you made the trip, but I can't use a woman like that." He said it plainly. He said it in a normal voice in a public square, and the words were out and they hung in the January air like something that couldn't be taken back. Naomi sat very still for a moment. She was aware of the children at the fence. She was aware of a woman outside the store who had her hand over her mouth. She was aware of a man off to the left, 30-ish, dark-coated, standing near the steps of what looked like a laundry, who was watching the whole thing with a kind of careful, uncomfortable attention that was different from the others. "All right," Naomi said. Holt blinked again, as if he'd expected more. She didn't give him more. She turned her chair and wheeled back toward the stage depot, where her trunk and toolbox had been set on the platform. "Okay." The depot agent was a small, harried man named Prescott, who smelled of ink and had the distracted air of someone permanently behind on his work. He told her the next stage, East, didn't run until Thursday. It was Monday. "Is there a hotel?" she asked. "Gorman's, end of 2nd Street. He hesitated. "It's got steps." "How many?" "4. "I've managed 4. She hadn't always managed 4. Some days 4 steps was nothing, and some days it was its own small war, depending on the surface and the chair and the state of her arms. But she didn't say that. "I'll need someone to help with my trunk," she said. Prescott sent a boy, maybe 14, who took one look at the wheelchair and then very deliberately looked only at the trunk for the entire 3-block distance to Gorman's hotel, which Naomi found almost sweet. The room was small and it was cold and the window faced an alley, but the bed was a reasonable height and the floorboards were smooth enough for the chair's wheels, and Naomi had stayed in worse places. She sat at the foot of the bed for a while after the boy left, not crying. She had stopped doing that in any useful way years ago, but just sitting with the particular weight of a day that had gone as badly as a day can go. She'd known, somewhere underneath the hope, that it might happen. She wasn't naive. She'd had a version of this conversation before, smaller versions. Employers who changed their mind, neighbors who withdrew their friendliness once they understood the permanence of the chair, a man in Cheyenne who had courted her for 6 weeks and then explained, awkwardly, that he'd realized he couldn't manage the practical complications. She knew how people looked at her before they knew her, and she knew how some of them kept looking at her that way regardless. What she hadn't known was whether she could survive a version of it at this scale, this public, this final. She opened her toolbox. It was a habit. When she didn't know what to do with herself, she inventoried the tools. She'd done it since she was 15, since the first time her father had handed her a box of her own. There was something grounding about it. Cold steel, known weights, things that did what they were supposed to do when used correctly. Hammer, chisels, 3 sizes, level, 2 handsaws, an adjustable square. Her brace and bits, pliers, screwdrivers, files and rasps, the fold-up measuring rod her father had given her the Christmas before the accident. She ran her thumb along the measuring rod and thought, "You came this far. You're still here. What are you going to do next?" Matit. She did not get on the stage Thursday. She told herself she was waiting on the weather, which was not untrue. A new storm had blown in Wednesday night, and the road east was closed again. But there was also something else, something she didn't fully examine but couldn't ignore. The feeling that leaving now, like this, would be a particular kind of defeat that she would carry for the rest of her life. In the meantime, she had to eat. She found the dining room on the hotel's ground floor and ate breakfast alone, which was normal, and then sat near the window for a while watching the town move. Black Creek was a working town. Supply wagons, men in heavy coats going in and out of the feed store, women carrying baskets, a blacksmith's hammer audible from 2 streets over. There was a rhythm to it, the rhythm of a place that had real work to do and was doing it. On her 3rd morning, she heard the argument. It came from the room next to the dining room, a supply closet or a small office, the walls thin enough that she could hear most of it. A woman's voice, frustrated. "The pump's been wrong for 6 weeks, Mr. Gorman." And a man's voice, the hotel owner. "I've had 2 men look at it. Neither one could find the problem." "There's a leak somewhere in the line. The pressure drops every time." "I know there's a leak, Mrs. Finch, I just don't know where." Naomi set down her coffee cup. She found Gorman in the hallway a few minutes later and explained that she knew something about pump systems. He looked at her the way people often looked at her when she said things like that, with the particular skepticism of someone who was deciding whether to humor her or dismiss her. And then, because the pump had been wrong for 6 weeks, and he had no better options, he showed her to the supply room. It took her 40 minutes to find the problem. A hairline crack in a joint connector 2 sections below the main valve. Invisible, unless you knew to look for it and knew how water under pressure behaved when it found a weakness. She didn't have the exact fitting to replace it, but she had a method for sealing it temporarily that would hold for weeks if done right, and she did it right. Gorman stood in the doorway of the supply room while she worked, not speaking, and when she was done and the pump pressure held steady on the first test, he said, "What do I owe you?" "A week's room," Naomi said, "and meals." He paid it. She wasn't sure if he was being fair or feeling guilty, and she decided it didn't matter. Seats. She fixed the pump on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, 3 other people had knocked on her hotel room door. The first was the woman from the general store, a brisk, gray-haired woman named Vera Dunmore, who needed help with a broken window mechanism on a storage case that had been stuck shut since October, trapping nearly $30 of dry goods she couldn't reach without breaking the glass. Naomi fixed it in 20 minutes. The second was the smithy's assistant, a boy of about 16 who explained with the embarrassed specificity of someone who had been sent by an adult too proud to come himself that the smithy's bellows had developed a problem with the air draw and the smith had been compensating for it all winter and his work was suffering. Naomi went and looked at it and explained what was wrong. a warped board in the bellows frame that had shifted the valve alignment, and sat in the smithy for 2 hours in the heat and the noise while she worked and fixed it. The third was a woman named Ada Chen who ran the laundry on the corner of Main and 2nd. No, that wasn't right. It was the man she'd noticed in the square on the day she'd arrived. The dark-coated one who'd watched with that careful expression. His name was Caleb Reed, she found out, and the laundry was his. He'd inherited it from his wife, who had started it and died of fever 3 winters ago, and he'd kept it running because he didn't know what else to do with himself, and also because the town needed it. He came to her door on a Tuesday evening, hat in his hands, and explained that one of his wringer mechanisms had seized, and he had a backlog of laundry he couldn't process. He said it without the hedging or the excessive politeness that some people used with her, and without looking at the chair with that evaluative look that she'd learned to read in people's eyes. He just said it plainly, the same way she'd have said it, and asked if she could help. She could help. She went that evening, in the last of the daylight. The laundry occupied a wide, low-ceilinged building with a long central workbench and 2 large tubs, and several lines strung across the rear section. The seized wringer was at the far end, an iron frame mechanism with a gear assembly that had rusted solid at the joint. Naomi examined it with her lamp, asked Caleb 2 questions about when it had started and whether there'd been water intrusion, and then spent the better part of an hour working the joint free with penetrating oil she'd brought in her kit and a methodical application of leverage that didn't force anything until it was ready to be forced. Caleb worked nearby while she worked, processing what laundry he could by hand, not watching her too closely, but present. He'd offered to move things around to make the space more navigable before she'd needed to ask, which she noticed. He didn't make a production of it. Around 9 o'clock, when the wringer was moving freely and she was cleaning up her tools, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why haven't you left?" He said it without judgment, just honest curiosity. After what Holt did, most people would have gone. Naomi considered the question. She had an answer, but she tested it first, the way she tested joints before applying weight. "Because leaving would mean he was right," she said. "And I don't think he was right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He wasn't." She looked at him. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, lean, with the hands of someone who worked hard and the eyes of someone who'd been quiet for a long time. There was nothing about him that performed itself. He just said the thing and let it sit. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "Gorman's." "You planning on staying?" She looked down at the wringer, now turning clean and easy on its axis. "I'm planning on figuring that out," she said. What happened next was not simple, because nothing about that winter was simple. She stayed. She kept taking jobs. Small ones, the kind of work that accumulated into something. And word spread in the particular way word spreads in small towns, through back fence conversations and offhand mentions in the dry goods store, the way one person tells another and they tell a third, and by the time it gets to the 4th person, it's been slightly enlarged by each telling. The woman with the toolbox. She fixed Gorman's pump. She got Chen's wringer working. She found the problem with the Dunmore store window that 2 carpenters had missed. Not everyone was glad about it. She first heard Gideon Pike's name from Vera Dunmore, who mentioned it the way you mention a weather condition, without enthusiasm, as an unavoidable fact of the landscape. Pike ran the largest general mercantile in Black Creek and had his hands in several other enterprises. The feed supply, the wagon repair, a piece of the only mill within 30 miles. He was, by Vera's careful accounting, a man who was useful to know and dangerous to cross, and who had built his position in the town on being the person people came to when they needed something they couldn't get anywhere else. "He doesn't like competition," Vera said, not quite looking at Naomi. "I'm not competing with anyone," Naomi said. "I fix things." "He has a man who does that. Repairs, maintenance, that kind of work. Charges accordingly." Vera picked up a bolt of muslin and moved it to a different shelf. "2 weeks ago you took 3 jobs that might have gone to that man." Pike noticed. Naomi thought about this later in her hotel room, sitting by the window with the measuring rod in her hands. She had not been in Black Creek 3 weeks. She had no business, no home, no formal arrangement with anyone. She had a toolbox and a wheelchair and a dwindling amount of money that would last another month at reasonable living expenses, less at Gorman's current rate. She could still leave. She sat with that thought and examined it honestly. Then she opened her notebook. She kept a small one for sketching mechanisms and noting measurements, and wrote at the top of a blank page, "What I need, what I have, what is possible." It took her an hour to work through it. When she was done, she had something that wasn't quite a plan and wasn't quite a decision, but was somewhere between the two. The shape of a thing she might build, if she stayed, if she worked, if nobody burned it down before she got it built. She thought about what Caleb Reed had said. He wasn't right. She closed the notebook and went to sleep. The day everything shifted the first time was a Friday in late January. A water pipe had burst in the back section of the hardware store. The store owned and operated by a man named Bert Calloway, who was not related to Pike, but was allied with him in the loose, cautious way of people who share a landscape they both want to control. Calloway had not been one of the people who'd come to Naomi for help, and she hadn't expected him to be. But it was 15 below that morning, and the pipe had burst and water was freezing on the hardware store floor, and Calloway's regular repairman was down with a bad chest, and Pike's man was somewhere up the valley and wouldn't be back until evening. Calloway came to Gorman's at 7 in the morning. He stood in the doorway of the dining room looking like a man who'd swallowed something unpleasant and hadn't decided whether to spit it out or keep going. "I heard you do repair work," he said. Naomi looked up from her coffee. "I do." Pipe burst. He gave her the location and the nature of the problem in short, dry sentences, the way a man talks when he's asking for help from someone he'd rather not need. "I'll pay your rate." "I'll come look at it," she said. She didn't tell him she could definitely fix it, because she hadn't seen it yet, and she wasn't in the habit of promising things before she could assess them. She went and looked, and the break was at a joint 6 feet from the exterior wall, the kind of clean break that happens when iron gets cold enough long enough, and she had the materials in her kit to do a temporary repair and the knowledge to tell him exactly what permanent fix he needed and where to order the parts. It took her 2.5 hours in a cold back room with water on the floor and her breath fogging in front of her. When it was done and holding, Calloway paid her without comment. But as she was putting her tools away, he said, with his back to her, "You're staying then?" "In Black Creek." "Looks like," she said. He didn't say anything else, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, and she thought, he'll tell Pike. He'll tell him tonight. She was right about that. She found out from Caleb they'd fallen into a pattern of occasional evenings at the laundry, him working and her sometimes working on something of her own, and sometimes just talking, which was its own kind of repair for both of them. That Pike had started asking questions about her. Who was she? Where was she from? Why was she really here? "What does he think I'm here for?" she asked. Caleb leaned against the work table with his arms crossed. "I don't think he knows. That's the problem. Pike doesn't like things he can't categorize." "I'm a woman with a toolbox," Naomi said. "That shouldn't be hard to categorize." "In his world, it doesn't fit into any box he has." Caleb paused. "He was asking if you had connections in Cheyenne, whether someone sent you." She almost laughed. "Someone sent me. His name was Elias Holt, and he told me he couldn't use me." "I know," Caleb said it quietly. "I was there. I remember." There was a moment between them, not uncomfortable, not exactly, but aware. She'd noticed things about him over the past few weeks. The way he listened without trying to fix what you were saying, the way he didn't fill silences with unnecessary words, the way he'd rearranged his laundry's entry access without her asking so the threshold was smooth. He was someone who noticed things and responded to them without making a performance of noticing. "Pike is going to try to make things difficult for you," Caleb said. "He's already talking to Calloway, probably to Gorman." "About what?" "About whether it's wise for the town to encourage someone like you to stay." "Someone like you." The phrase sat in the air. She'd heard versions of it before, and it always meant the same thing. Someone who doesn't fit our category, who makes us uncertain about categories we've built our certainty on. "Let him talk," she said. "I'm not sure that's enough." "No," she agreed, "but it's what I've got right now." She stayed at the laundry later than usual that night, working on a hinge mechanism for a cabinet she'd promised Vera Dunmore, and Caleb made coffee on the small stove in the corner, and they drank it without talking much. And it was the most settled she'd felt since she stepped off the stage into that gray January square. Outside, the wind found every crack in the building's walls and tried each one. The lamp held steady. The coffee was strong and a little bitter. She thought, this is something. This is not nothing. She thought, stay. The hinge for Vera Dunmore's cabinet was finished by the end of the week, and it worked the way good hinges are supposed to work. Quietly, without complaint, holding weight it was designed to hold. Vera tested it twice, swinging the cabinet door open and closed, and then looked at Naomi with an expression that was somewhere between pleased and assessing. You want more work, Vera said. It wasn't a question. I'd take it. Vera set her hands on the counter. She was the kind of woman who thought with her hands, who touched things when she was deciding something. There's a storage loft at the back of the store. The pulley system for moving goods up there broke last fall, and we've been carrying everything by hand. 2 men threw their backs out. I can look at it. I know you can look at it. Can you fix it? I don't know until I look at it, Naomi said, which was the honest answer, and Vera seemed to appreciate that more than a confident yes. The pulley system took most of a morning. The problem was not the pulley itself, but the mounting bracket, which had been bolted into a section of wall that had more give in it than the original installer had accounted for. And over time, the angle had shifted just enough to throw the rope off the track under any real load. Naomi rebuilt the bracket mount into the adjacent beam, which was solid, and rerouted the rope line 2 inches to compensate for the angle. She tested it with 70 pounds of flour. It held without a tremble. Vera paid her in cash and also in something more useful. She mentioned it to 4 people before noon. By February, Naomi had more work than she could easily keep track of without a system, so she made one. She kept a small ledger: jobs, dates, materials used, what she charged, what she was owed. The numbers were modest. She was not getting rich, but she was getting enough, and enough was a thing she knew how to build on. She moved out of Gorman's in the 2nd week of February. The new arrangement was with a widow named Mrs. Falk, who kept a large house on the eastern edge of Main Street and rented 2 rooms to boarders. One of those rooms was on the ground floor, which mattered, and Mrs. Falk had no steps at her front entrance, only a wide plank porch level with the boardwalk, which mattered even more. The rent was lower than Gorman's, and the meals were better, and Mrs. Falk was the kind of woman who minded her own business with such consistent dedication that it was almost a philosophy. The other boarder was a school teacher named Henry Marsh, who was thin and young and perpetually worried about his students in the way that young teachers sometimes are before the job either breaks them or hardens them into something sustainable. He was not unfriendly, just distracted, and he had the useful quality of accepting Naomi's presence at the breakfast table without any particular need to discuss it. She was finding that there were people in Black Creek like that, people who absorbed new information and kept moving, who didn't require the world to be fixed into shapes they'd already decided on. They weren't the majority, but they were enough to make a foothold out of, if you were careful. The ones who were not like that made themselves known around the same time. She was working outside the Dunmore store one afternoon in early February, a repair on the exterior door frame that had swelled with cold and ice and was sticking badly, when she heard it, not directed at her or not entirely, 2 men talking on the boardwalk across the street, voices not lowered enough. Heard Pike say it's a liability. Woman like that running around with tools, gets hurt on a job, who's responsible? She got a contract with anyone? Written? Hell if I know. That's Pike's point, I think. No proper arrangement, just taking work from people without any kind of formal, she fixed Calloway's pipe. That's what I mean. That's Calloway's business. And if something goes wrong downstream, she kept working. The wood plane moved in long strokes, shaving the swollen edge of the door frame, and she kept her attention on the grain and the angle and the work in front of her. The voices moved on eventually. She finished the door frame, and it swung clean. What Pike was doing, she understood, was not dramatic. It wasn't a direct attack, at least not yet. It was the slower, more corrosive kind of opposition, the kind that worked by placing uncertainty in people's minds. Is she reliable? Is she legitimate? Is she going to cause problems? Questions that didn't need answers to do damage. The asking was enough. She thought about it that evening at Caleb's laundry and said so. He's not wrong that you don't have a formal arrangement, Caleb said. He was folding dry laundry at the long table, his movements practiced and absent, the way people move when they've done something so many times it lives in the muscle. You've been working job to job. What would a formal arrangement look like? Something in writing, maybe? That you're operating as a repair and maintenance service? That you're accountable for your work. He paused. There's no ordinance against it. Town's not incorporated technically, but it might give people something solid to point to. You've been thinking about this, Naomi said. He glanced at her sideways. Little bit. She'd brought her notebook and she opened it now, the pages soft from use, the pencil marks of her measurements and diagrams overlapping across weeks of use. What else? Caleb was quiet for a moment, moving the folded laundry into a basket, and she'd learned enough about him by now to know that the quiet was not evasion. He was actually thinking, running through something carefully before he said it. I've got space, he said finally. Back corner of the building. Decent square footage. I've been using it for storage, but I could clear it if you wanted a proper workspace instead of working out of a hotel room. She looked up. I'm not offering charity, he added, as if he'd anticipated the look. You'd pay rent. Same rate the dry goods storage was costing me, which is nothing impressive, but it's a real arrangement and you could call it your shop and nobody could tell you you're just a woman drifting around with a toolbox. The lamp between them made the shadows long. Naomi looked at him. This quiet man who had watched her arrive and get humiliated in a public square and had not said anything then, but had been paying attention ever since. Why? She asked. Because you're good, he said. And because this town needs good things more than it needs Gideon Pike's version of what's appropriate. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she said yes. They wrote it out. A simple rental agreement, 1 page, witnessed by Mrs. Falk, who had a firm and legible handwriting and seemed vaguely amused to be involved. Naomi paid first and last month up front, which nearly cleaned out her reserves, which meant the next month had to work. That was fine. She operated better with her back to a wall anyway. It was how she'd always been. The back corner of Caleb's building was drafty and needed 2 days of cleaning, during which Naomi found 3 broken chair frames, a collection of iron hardware in a crate, 1 complete but rusted handsaw, and a mouse nest in a wooden box that she relocated with minimal ceremony. She built a workbench herself, from lumber she bought from the mill at cost because the mill operator, a man named James Thayer, had once had a flooding problem in his grain room, and she'd solved it in 3 hours when no one else could. That was how the economy of the thing worked. Not money exactly, not yet, but exchange. Reputation as currency. She did good work and people noticed, and some of them helped, and some of them talked, and the talking brought more work. She put a small sign outside her section of the door. Nothing elaborate, just N. Hartwell, Repair and Engineering. Ask inside. The day after she put the sign up, she found it turned face to the wall. She turned it back out. The second day, someone had scratched something into the wood below her name. She didn't need to squint to read it. Go home. She stood there in the cold for a moment, looking at it. The street behind her had its usual morning traffic. A supply wagon, a woman with a basket, the schoolteacher walking fast toward the other end of town. She went inside, found a wood rasp in her kit, and spent 10 minutes filing the scratched letters down until they were smooth. Then she re-lettered her name deeper into the wood, with a proper engraving chisel, so it would take considerable effort to remove. She did not mention it to Caleb. But she thought Caleb probably noticed, because he noticed most things, and he didn't mention it either. What he did do, 3 days later, was put her sign on a proper bracket he'd made and mounted it where it was less accessible from the street. He said nothing about it. She said nothing about it. That was how they communicated most things, through actions that meant more than what was said about them. By the middle of February, she had a shop and a sign and a ledger with 12 jobs recorded in it. She also had, in the particular way of frontier towns, something like a reputation, though it was still being argued over. The argument took place in Gideon Pike's mercantile, in the back room where he kept his account books and received people he considered worth receiving. Naomi was not present for it, but she heard about it later from Vera Dunmore, who heard it from the woman who cleaned Pike's back office, who had the particular invisibility of people who clean rooms. Other people treat as private. Pike's position apparently was threefold: that Naomi had no established roots in the town, no legitimate business standing, and was drawing work away from people who'd been part of the community for years. What he didn't say, but what sat underneath all 3 points like a fourth leg on a stool, was that she was not what he expected people in his town to be. He used the word appropriate 4 times, Vera told her, with the dry precision of someone reporting field conditions. In my experience, when a man uses that word that many times in one conversation, he's not talking about appropriateness. He's talking about control. Naomi thought Vera was exactly right. She also thought the next few weeks were going to be interesting in an exhausting way. She was not wrong. The first direct obstacle was the mill supply. She'd been ordering raw materials, iron stock, timber, various hardware, through Thayer's mill and through a Cheyenne supplier who delivered to Black Creek twice a month. In early March, her Cheyenne order didn't arrive. The following delivery, same thing. She wrote to the supplier and received a letter back that was polite and unclear, mentioning a change in their regional distribution, regrets, etc. She found out later, through a second letter to a different contact in Cheyenne, that someone had spoken to the supplier about her. The word used to her contact was unreliable, applied to her as a customer. She did not know for certain it was Pike. She was fairly certain it was Pike. She found new suppliers. It cost her time and a bit more money, and 3 letters and one awkward conversation with a hardware merchant in Laramie who didn't know what to make of her, but was ultimately interested in business. She rebuilt the supply line in 2 weeks. She told Caleb about it one evening while she was working on a mechanism for one of his laundry machines, and he was going over his accounts at the other end of the table. "He cut off your supply chain?" Caleb set down his pen. "Someone did. I can't prove it was Pike." "Does it need to be proven right now?" "No, it needed to be solved. I solved it." She kept her attention on the mechanism, a worn gear she was filing back to tolerance. "But it tells me something. He's not going to just talk. He's willing to act." Caleb was quiet for a moment. She could feel him thinking from across the table. "You know what his arrangement is with Callaway?" he said. "Generally. They share suppliers, I think, and Pike has some kind of stake in the wagon repair." "More than a stake. Pike controls the financing on Callaway's wagon inventory. Callaway can't replace his stock without Pike's credit." He paused. "He's got similar arrangements with 4 other businesses in town. Maybe 5. Naomi set down the file. "How do you know this?" Caleb looked slightly uncomfortable, in the way of a man who has been holding information and is now deciding whether it's past time to share it. "My wife, before she died, she kept books for some of those businesses. Side work, she was good with numbers. Some of what she knew, she told me. And some of what she found, she wrote down." "What did she write down?" "That Pike's terms aren't what he says they are. That the interest rates he charges are higher than what the men know, because the agreements are written in language most of them didn't fully understand when they signed. That several of the businesses in this town are more in debt to him than they realize." The room was quiet, except for the wind against the roof and the small sounds of the stove. "That's not just unpleasant," Naomi said. "That's fraud." "Probably. Maybe. I don't know enough about the law to say for certain." Caleb looked at his hands. "My wife found it by accident. She wasn't looking for it, and she didn't know what to do about it. She'd started making notes. She was sick by then, and she ran out of time." Naomi thought about a woman who'd built this laundry, who'd kept careful books, who'd found something wrong and started gathering evidence and then run out of time to do anything with it. She thought about the specific helplessness of that. "Do you still have the notes?" she asked. "Yes." "Can I see them?" He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because I'm good at reading structures," she said. "Mechanisms, how things are built and where the weaknesses are. Finance isn't that different from engineering once you understand the system." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he got up and went to the back of the laundry, to a locked wooden box she'd noticed before and assumed was spare cash. He came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle of papers and set it on the table between them. They spent 3 hours on those papers. Naomi read slowly and carefully, tracing the numbers, the terms, the language of the agreements. Some of it she understood immediately. Some of it required Caleb to explain context, who the businesses were, what their situations had been when they signed. By the end, the picture that emerged was not ambiguous. "He's been skimming compounding interest on terms that were presented as flat rate," she said. "Anyone with a reasonable education in finance would catch it eventually, but most of these men are not. They're ranchers and tradespeople. They run their own books, but they don't have training in contract language." She tapped one of the documents. "This one is the clearest. Callaway's wagon agreement. The rate he signed says 4%. The actual mechanism of the agreement, the way the interest compounds quarterly against a moving principal, it's closer to 11. Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. 7%. Over 3 years on Callaway's debt, that's Substantial, yes. He'll deny it. Say they misread the terms. Probably. She began putting the papers back in order. But if you have documentation from when your wife was keeping their books, her notes on what they understood versus what's in the agreements, that's a record of intent. You're saying go public with it. I'm saying you have something. I'm not saying what to do with it yet. That depends on what you want. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and the lamp between them burned steadily. What would you do? He asked. She thought about turned signs, scratched wood, supply lines cut, a man who said someone like you without lowering his voice. She thought about 11 days in a way station and an empty square in January and a toolbox on her lap. I'd wait, she said, until the moment was right, and then I'd make sure there were witnesses. The moment did not come immediately. What came first was March, and with March came the brief false thaw that the high country sometimes produced. 3 or 4 days of warmth that felt like a promise and wasn't, and then the return of cold, but a lesser cold, and with it the sense of winter losing its grip. The town breathed differently in that shift. People came out more, stayed on the boardwalks longer, lingered in conversations. Naomi's work changed in character. More outdoor work, more structural assessment, people who'd been putting off exterior repairs waiting for winter to ease. She spent a morning on the roof of the schoolhouse helping Henry Marsh assess where the shingles had lifted, and an afternoon looking at the creekside foundation of a warehouse that Thayer had been worried about since the last melt season. She was developing, she realized, a map of Black Creek. Not a geographical one, she understood the streets soon enough, but a structural map, where the buildings were solid and where they had weakness. Which structures had been built well and which had been built fast. The town was 20 years old in most of its bones, and some of it was starting to show. Henry Marsh, on the roof of the schoolhouse, looking out over the town in the thin March sunlight, said, "Does it bother you? People staring." "Some days," she said honestly. "My students ask me about you, the older ones." "What do they ask?" "Whether you're going to stay, whether you're Mr. Reed's friend." He said the last part with the studied neutrality of someone reporting a fact, not editorializing. "I tell them I don't know, and that it's none of their business." "What do you think?" Henry Marsh considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. "I think you're good at what you do, and I think the town needs people like that more than it needs people who've decided what the town is already supposed to look like." He shrugged, a little awkward. "That's just what I think." She filed it away. These small attestations, not dramatic declarations, just people saying plainly what they saw, they were accumulating into something she hadn't quite named yet. At the end of March, she got her hardest job. It came from an unlikely direction. Ed Briggs, who ran the small freighting operation on the south end of town, and who had been, by all her observation, firmly in Pike's orbit. He came to her shop on a Wednesday afternoon with his hat in his hands and a specific kind of hunched posture that told her he didn't want anyone to see him here. "Got a problem with my wagon axle," he said. "Cracked. I need to run a load to the mills Thursday, and if I don't run it, I lose the contract and—" He stopped. "Your rate's the same as what I heard?" "Depends what it needs," she said. He brought her to see the wagon. The axle had a fracture that ran 2/3 of the way through the wood near the right wheel hub, invisible unless you knew to look for it. She found it by running her hand along the underside and feeling the flex. It was not a job that could be done fast. She would need to fabricate a reinforcing bracket and seat it properly, which meant heat work, and she didn't have a forge. She went to the smithy. The smith, Carl, was the spare man of few words who had warmed to her since the bellows repair, which had measurably improved his work, and he was honest enough to acknowledge it. He let her use his forge for 2 hours in exchange for a repair to his flue damper that she did in 40 minutes. The axle bracket took the 2 hours and more patience than she had to spare. She pressed it, fitted it, tested it under load. By 9 that evening it was done, and Briggs could run his Thursday freight. He paid her. Then he said, standing in the lamplight of the shop, "Pike's going to hear I came to you." "Probably." "He won't like it." "I know." Briggs looked at the wagon axle. "Did a good job," he said. Not warmly exactly, but honestly. "Better than his man would have done." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an alliance. But it was a crack in something, and she'd been in the business long enough, in the business of working on things that seemed solid until they weren't, to know that cracks, once they started, had a way of spreading. Caleb was still awake when she got back to the laundry. He'd left a lamp on for her in the shop, which he'd started doing without comment a few weeks earlier, and she found him sitting with a cup of coffee at the table, not working, just sitting. "Briggs came to you," he said. "You heard already." Small town. She put her kit away, running through the familiar inventory out of habit. He said Pike would hear about it. He already knows someone saw Briggs's wagon outside. Caleb wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He came by here this evening, Pike." She looked up. "What did he want?" "To have a conversation about my business arrangements?" Caleb said it steadily, but she could hear what was under it. "He mentioned that my linen supply contract with the hotel was coming up for renewal. He mentioned that Gorman has an outstanding loan from his credit line." She understood immediately. It wasn't a threat in words. It never was, with men like Pike. It was a demonstration of architecture. "Look at how everything connects to me. Look at where the weight is sitting." "What did you tell him?" she asked. Caleb looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not quite, but something with more heat in it than his usual steadiness. "I told him," Caleb said, "that my business arrangements were my own, and that I'd be keeping them." The lamp held steady. The wind moved outside. Naomi sat down at the table across from him, and they stayed there for a while without saying anything, and it was the kind of silence that meant more than most conversations. She thought about the papers in the cloth bundle. She thought about timing and witnesses. She thought about Caleb's wife, who had started gathering evidence and run out of time. "We have time," she thought. "Not unlimited, but some. Enough to do this right." She picked up her coffee cup. Caleb picked up his. They sat there while the night settled around the building, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that whatever was coming soon, and neither of them was going to back away from it. The papers stayed in the cloth bundle for another 3 weeks, while Naomi thought about how to use them. It wasn't that she was afraid, exactly. It was that she'd spent enough time working on structures to understand that the order of operations mattered as much as the work itself. You didn't pull a load-bearing element before you had something ready to replace it. You didn't expose a weakness in a system until you understood everything that system was connected to. Pike's system was connected to most of Black Creek. She made a list in her notebook, not of the businesses, she already knew those, but of the people. Who owed Pike money? Who was allied with him out of choice versus necessity? Who had something to gain from his continued influence and who was simply too close to the center of gravity to pull away without losing their footing? It was not a comfortable list to construct because it required her to think about people she'd grown to respect. Calloway, who'd come to her in an emergency and paid her fairly. Briggs, who'd driven his axle in and said, "Did a good job," in the thin, honest voice of a man who didn't give compliments easily. And to understand that their proximity to Pike was not entirely their fault. That was the thing about men like Gideon Pike. They were useful. That was how they got their position, and it was also what made them hard to dislodge. You couldn't just expose the bad without accounting for the legitimate need that had let them entrench themselves in the first place. She explained this to Caleb on a Thursday evening in early April, sitting at opposite ends of his work table with the bundle between them and 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold. "If we go to the county with the loan documents without anything else, Pike's attorney, and he has one in Laramie, argues it's a misunderstanding of terms. The men signed in good faith. Where's the proof of intent?" She tapped the cloth bundle. "Your wife's notes help, but they're handwritten observations from someone who's deceased. Pike will call them hearsay or worse." "Worse," Caleb said. "He'll say she misunderstood what she was recording. She wasn't trained as an accountant." "Right. So we need corroboration. We need at least 2 of the affected business owners to say, in writing or in front of witnesses, that the terms they understood when they signed are different from what the agreement actually computes to." "Calloway won't do it. He's too dependent on Pike's next credit line." "I know, but Briggs might. And there's the widow Tanner. She runs the seamstress shop on 2nd Street. Her husband signed a supply credit before he died, and she's been paying it ever since without knowing what she's actually paying. She'd had this information from Vera, who had it from the widow Tanner herself, who had mentioned it once in the quiet, accepting way of someone who'd decided there was nothing to be done. If someone explained the actual numbers to her, she'd be furious, Caleb said. She should be. He turned his coffee cup in circles on the table, a habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was moving through a problem. You'd have to be careful how you approach her. She's proud. She won't want to feel like she's being used. I'm not going to use her. I'm going to tell her what her husband signed and what she's been paying and what the difference is and let her decide what she wants to do about it. That's not using someone. That's information. Caleb looked at her steadily. She held the look. You've done this before, he said. Not this, but thought through something this way. My father worked on contracts sometimes, bridge projects, building projects. He'd explain the financing to me the same way he explained the load calculations. He said you can't separate the money from the structure. One fails, the other follows. She picked up her coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. I'm trying to do this right. I don't want to just blow something up. I want it to stay blown up. They approached the Widow Tanner on a Saturday, which was when her shop was quieter. She was a small, self-contained woman in her late 50s with a measuring tape permanently around her neck and the kind of stillness that comes from 30 years of patient, precise work. She received them in the back of her shop, among bolts of fabric and half-finished garments on dress forms. And she listened to Naomi explain the numbers with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression giving away nothing. When Naomi finished, the Widow Tanner said, "Show me the paper." Naomi showed her the relevant agreement. Caleb had made a careful copy of it, and walked her through the computation. The Widow Tanner followed it without apparent difficulty. She had the same quality Vera did, of being sharper than she let people assume. At the end, she said, "How much have I overpaid total?" Naomi had worked this out. She gave her the number. The Widow Tanner sat with it for a moment. Her hands stayed folded. My husband signed this before he got sick. He was trusting that what Pike told him was what the paper said. I know, Naomi said. He wasn't a stupid man. The language is designed to be unclear. That's not an accident. The Widow Tanner looked at the copied agreement for another moment, then handed it back. What do you need from me? They needed a statement. Her account of what her husband had been told versus what the document actually said. She gave it to them that afternoon, written in her own clear, careful hand, signed and dated. Briggs took longer. He came and went twice from the conversation before he committed, and his reluctance was honest. He was worried about his freight contract, about the next winter, about the specific vulnerability of a man who had borrowed future income to keep his present business solvent. Naomi understood. She told him so. She also told him plainly that Pike already knew he'd brought her his wagon, and that whatever shelter he thought he had from staying quiet was probably already compromised. He knows I came to you, Briggs said. He knows, and he'll use it against you eventually, one way or another. That's what he does. Briggs looked out the window of his freight office for a long moment. If this goes wrong, it might go wrong, she said, which was not what he wanted to hear but was the truth. I can't promise you otherwise. I can tell you that doing nothing has its own cost, and it's compounding. He gave them his statement the following week. By the middle of April, Naomi had the Widow Tanner's account, Briggs's statement, the original documents from Caleb's wife, and a written analysis in her own hand that laid out the arithmetic simply enough that anyone could follow it. She had copies made, 3 sets, and she sent one to the county seat by post and kept 2. She did not tell many people. Vera knew because Vera had facilitated the approach to the Widow Tanner, and because Vera was the kind of woman who found out things regardless. Henry Marsh knew because he'd seen her working late and asked a direct question and she'd answered it, which she slightly regretted afterward, not because she didn't trust him, but because it was one more person carrying knowledge that put them in a position. And then something happened that changed the timeline considerably. It was a Tuesday evening, the last week of April, and she was working in the shop with the door open because the temperature had finally, decisively, crossed into something that felt like actual spring. She heard the argument from the street, 2 men, voices escalating, and looked out to see one of Pike's workers, a broad-shouldered man named Dutch, who ran the loading dock at the Mercantile, standing in front of Caleb's main entrance. Caleb was in the doorway. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. Something about an account, about what was owed, about what Pike was willing to do about it. Caleb's voice was steady. Dutch's was not. She rolled to the doorway of her section and looked out. Dutch saw her, and his expression changed. Not softening, but shifting, the calculation that goes through some men's faces when the audience gets larger. "You," Dutch said. He said it the way people sometimes said it to her, like the word itself was a category that explained everything. "You're the one behind all this." "Behind what?" she asked. "All this digging around in things that aren't your business, running around asking questions." "I repair things," she said. "That's my business." "That ain't all you've been doing, and everybody knows it," Caleb said quietly. "Dutch, walk away. Pike's going to—" "I don't care what Pike's going to," Caleb said, and the steadiness in his voice had something underneath it now that wasn't quite anger, but was in the neighborhood. "This is my property. Walk away." Dutch walked away, but he looked at Naomi once more before he left, and it was the kind of look that doesn't need words to carry its meaning. That night, Caleb sat at the table and didn't pretend to work. Naomi didn't pretend either. She set down the file she'd been holding and looked at him. "It's getting close," she said. "Yeah." "The county should have received the packet by now. It'll take them time to assess it. Weeks, maybe more. In the meantime, Pike knows something is moving. He can feel it even if he doesn't know what. Men like that always can." She thought about the sign that had been turned face to wall, the scratched letters, the supply chain she'd had to rebuild. None of those had been accidents or random malice. They'd been responses to something Pike perceived as a threat before it had fully formed. Now that it had formed, now that there were signed statements somewhere in the county postal system, she thought the responses would escalate accordingly. She was right. She just hadn't anticipated the particular form it would take. The first fire happened on a Wednesday. It was small, a pile of lumber behind the freight office, dry wood from the winter stores Briggs had stacked against the fence. It caught sometime in the night and burned itself mostly out before anyone noticed, and what was left by morning was a charred fence section and a lost stack of good pine. Briggs called it an accident. Naomi thought about the statement Briggs had signed and the week of hesitation that had preceded it, and she thought Briggs probably knew it wasn't an accident, but had decided that saying so out loud would cost more than he was willing to pay right now. She didn't push it. It was his decision to make. The second fire was harder to explain away. It happened 10 days later at the edge of the mill property, a small outbuilding used for equipment storage. Thayer lost 2 sets of chains, a spare blade assembly, and a month's worth of small ironwork. The fire started from the outside, and even Thayer, who was a man of remarkable restraint in his conclusions, said flatly, "That didn't start itself." The town started paying attention in a different way after that. Not the curious, watchful attention of people observing an interesting newcomer, but the alert, anxious attention of people who feel something dangerous moving in a place they thought they understood. Vera came to the shop the morning after the mill fire and sat down without preamble. "He's going to keep doing this," she said, "until he establishes that opposing him costs more than accepting him." "I know. What does the county need to act?" "Time, and probably more than we've given them." Naomi kept her voice level. "The documents are solid, the arithmetic is unambiguous, but bureaucracy works at its own pace." Vera looked at her in the way of someone who has more to say and is deciding how to say it. "Dutch has been talking at the saloon, about you specifically, about how certain people have been stirring up trouble and hiding behind a woman in a wheelchair like she's some kind of shield." Naomi stared at the workbench for a moment. "He's repositioning," she said, "making me the target. If he can get the town to see me as the cause of the instability rather than his response to being exposed, that's useful to him." "Yes," Vera said simply. "It is." That evening, Naomi worked late. She wasn't doing anything in particular. She had a chair repair she'd been putting off, and she worked on it without any particular urgency, her hands moving through the familiar process of assessing a joint, cleaning it, fitting a new dowel with the proper tolerance. She was thinking. When Caleb came back from locking up the front, he stood in the doorway between his space and hers and said, "You're still here." Still here. He came and sat in this chair he'd taken to occupying when she worked evenings, a 3-legged stool that was slightly too low for the table, which he'd never bothered to remedy. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. "I've been thinking about my wife's notes," he said, "about what she was doing when she found the discrepancies." "What about it?" "She told me once she almost went to one of the other merchants. showed them the numbers, asked if they'd seen the same thing in their agreements. She didn't, because she got sick shortly after, and by the time she was... He stopped, rearranged his hands. She told me she wished she hadn't waited, that she'd been afraid of what it would cause, and that the thing she'd been afraid of was going to happen anyway, and the only difference was she'd be less able to affect it. He said it quietly, and she heard the several things in it. Grief, obviously, but also something he was working out as he said it. "I don't want to wait the way she waited," he said. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that waiting for the county is the right legal move, but it's not the only move, and that Pike's working on town opinion right now, actively, and if he gets enough of it pointing at you before the county responds, he neutralizes the documents," she said. "Even if the county acts, he's already poisoned what people here believe." She set down the chair she was working on. "We need to get ahead of it." How? She thought about it for a minute. What she kept returning to was what Vera had said. He's repositioning, making me the target. It was a tactic she recognized from the kind of structural problems she dealt with. When something was exposed in one place, you reinforced the adjacent connections and redirected attention. You didn't address the exposure, you shifted what people were looking at. "Town meeting," she said. Caleb looked up. "Not formal, not official, just people gathered. Vera knows everyone. Mrs. Falk is connected to everyone else. If we could get the widow Tanner, Briggs, Thayer, a few others, and just have the conversation openly. Let people hear the numbers from someone who was affected, not from us. Pike will find out before it happens, probably. But if we can get the information into the air before he can frame the response, that's something." She looked at him. "It'll also make us more visible targets." "We're already targets," he said. "Bigger targets." He thought about it. Outside, the wind moved, and somewhere in the distance, the horses in the livery shifted, and the town made its small nighttime sounds. "Set it up," he said. Vera organized it within 4 days, which told Naomi that Vera had been waiting for someone to suggest it. It was held in the back of the Dunmore store on a Sunday afternoon, after the normal business of the day, in the wide storage room where Naomi had fixed the pulley system back in February. About 15 people came. Less than she'd hoped, more than she'd feared. Thayer spoke first because he was the most recent loss and the most tangible. He showed the numbers from his mill account, not the fraud documents, but his own records of what he'd paid versus what he'd been told. And he laid it out in the plain, aggrieved voice of a man who had done the math and found it wrong and could not stop being angry about it. The widow Tanner spoke second. She was precise, and she was controlled, and she was more devastating than either, because she had clearly been thinking about her husband for weeks, and she spoke about the agreement he'd signed with the specific, contained fury of someone who had decided on the uses of their anger. Briggs didn't speak directly, but he was there, and his presence meant something. Naomi spoke last. She explained the structure, not accusatorially, not dramatically, just the mechanism, how the interest compounded, where the language obscured the math, what the difference was between what had been agreed to in conversation and what had been codified in the signed document. She answered 3 questions from people in the room, clearly and without hedging. She did not look at the door while she spoke. She made herself not look. But she was aware of it, the way you're aware of the one unsecured point in a structure, say, a low awareness, constant, running underneath everything else. When she was done, there was a long quiet in the room. Then a man she didn't know well, one of the smaller ranchers from outside town who'd come in for supplies, said, "What happens now?" "The county has the documentation," Naomi said. "What happens here depends on what people in this town decide." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in her room at Mrs. Falk's and stared at the ceiling and went through the engineering of it, the way she went through any problem. What was load-bearing, what was decorative, what would fail first under pressure. She kept arriving at the same answer, which was that the weakest point was Caleb. Not because he lacked courage, he had more of it than he showed, but because his business was the most exposed. His linen contract, his credit arrangements, the supply relationships his wife had built and he'd maintained for 3 years. Pike could reach those before the county could reach Pike. She had been thinking about something else for weeks without quite letting herself think it directly. She let herself think it now. That she had pulled Caleb into the center of something dangerous, and that some portion of what he was risking because of her, because of the space in his building and the evenings at the work table, and the papers his wife had left. She didn't know what to do with that. She was better at structures than she was at the kind of thing that happened between people when the structures got personal. In the morning, she made herself coffee and ate breakfast and went to the shop and worked. A gate hinge for a rancher from outside town. A cracked handle on a water pump mechanism. Small work, which was most of what kept the light on, and she did it without letting herself spiral. At noon, Caleb put his head in the door between the spaces and said, "You here?" She looked up. His face told her something had happened. "What?" "Dutch was at the saloon last night after the meeting. He was saying—" Caleb came all the way in, pulled the door shut behind him. "He was saying that the town needs to think carefully about who it's been letting operate here. That certain outsiders have come in with an agenda to destabilize established business relationships." That's the language he used. Established business relationships. Pike's language, Naomi said. Word for word, probably. He crossed his arms. He also said something else. About the shop. She waited. He said it would be a shame if something happened to it, before whoever built it had a chance to get proper roots down. Caleb said it with the flat, controlled delivery of someone reporting something they're furious about. He said something happened to it like he was talking about the weather. Naomi set down the gate hinge. "When was this?" "Last night. I didn't hear it myself. Thayer's son was there. He told his father. Thayer told me an hour ago." She sat with it for a moment. "He's moved from discrediting to threatening," she said. "That's a change." "It's an escalation." "Yes." She looked at the workbench, at the small organized order of her tools. She thought about the sign she'd re-lettered with a chisel so it would be harder to damage. She thought about what Caleb's wife had said, that she'd been afraid of what it would cause, and the thing she'd been afraid of was going to happen anyway. "We can't leave the shop unattended overnight," she said. "I'll sleep here," Caleb said. "So will I." He looked at her. "Naomi—" "I'll sleep here," she said again. "It's my shop. I'm not going to sit at Mrs. Falk's hoping nothing happens." He didn't argue. She brought her kit and a blanket, and they arranged themselves in the laundry that evening, Caleb at his side, her at hers. And it was the strangest combination of domestic and tense, of the ordinary and the waiting. And they talked for a while about small things because the small things were easier than the large ones. And eventually the talking stopped and the building settled around them, and the night went quiet. She woke at 3 a.m. to the smell of smoke. She came awake fast, the way people do when their body knows something before their mind catches up. She was moving before she'd fully processed what the smell meant, pulling herself into the chair that she kept positioned next to the makeshift cot, and she was at the internal door to Caleb's side before the coughing started. "Caleb." She put as much volume into it as she had. "Caleb, fire." He was up in seconds, and she heard him. The feet on the floor, the crash of something knocked over. And then he was at the door, and the smoke was coming from the back, from the exterior wall on the western side. "It's outside," he said, getting his boots. "Not inside yet." "The wood stack," she said. "Same as Briggs." He was already moving toward the rear. She went to the main door and got it open and felt the cold outside air come in, which was useful and also fed oxygen to whatever was burning at the back. She went out on the boardwalk and looked. She could see the orange edge of it, around the corner, and she could hear it now, the specific crackling energy of wood that has been burning long enough to establish itself. "Caleb!" She put the distance of her voice into it, and she heard his response from around the back. And she heard him working the water barrel, the splash, the hiss. What he couldn't do alone was manage the back wall. The laundry had a wooden back wall, and the fire was at its base, and if it got into the wall— She went around the side of the building. The terrain was rough here, not the smooth boardwalk of the front, and the wheels of the chair caught twice on frozen ground, and she worked through it by brute arm strength and the accumulated practice of 3 years of navigating a world that wasn't built for her. By the time she got to the back, Caleb had thrown 2 barrels on it, and it was reduced but not out, and he was going back for a third. "The wall," she said, because she could see what he couldn't from his angle. The base of the exterior boards was beginning to char where the fire had been longest. "I see it." She went to the second water barrel and found the ladle and threw water on the wall base while he refilled from the well, and they worked like that. Not talking, just doing, passing water in the bucket he produced from somewhere, until the fire was out and the wall was wet and the smoke was the heavy kind that means something's dead rather than the light. Kind that means something's still going. Caleb stood in the charred mess and breathed hard for a moment. Naomi's arms were shaking. She let them shake, braced against the chair, and looked at what was left. The fire had been set at the base of the wall. She could see it clearly now, the way the burn pattern concentrated at a single point rather than spreading from within, which was the signature of fire that had been helped to start. Someone had stacked kindling against the exterior wall and lit it. Not elaborate, not sophisticated, just effective. "Enough," Caleb said. He said it quietly, but it had more in it than a quiet word usually carries. She looked at him. His face in the gray dark was not panicked or angry so much as resolved. The expression of someone who has been waiting for something to go far enough and has now identified the line. "We go to the sheriff tomorrow," he said. "With what evidence? The burn pattern? The timing? The threat Dutch made last night? I know what we have. I know it might not be enough. I'm going anyway." She looked at the scorched base of the wall, the damaged siding, the wide, dark mess of it. She thought about what it would have been if they hadn't been here. She thought about her shop, on the other side of that wall. "All right," she said. They went inside. Caleb put the stove on and made coffee because it was 4 a.m. and neither of them was going back to sleep. They sat at the work table in the smoke-tinged air and drank it, and outside the sky began to go the early gray that comes before actual dawn, and the town was quiet with the particular quiet of people who don't know yet what almost happened. She was thinking about the Widow Tanner's statement, about Briggs's statement, about the packet at the county seat, about the slow machinery of legitimate process and the faster, uglier machinery of a man who had decided to stop being subtle. She was thinking about what came next when she heard a shout from the street. Both of them looked up. Then a second voice, higher, more urgent, and Caleb was already at the door when she heard the word, "Fire." Not theirs this time. Somewhere else. Down the block from the sound of it, and as Caleb got the door open, the first light of dawn caught the smoke rising from 2 streets over, heavy and dark. The color of something structural burning, not just kindling. She looked at where it was coming from. "That's the old storage building," Caleb said. "The one Thayer's been using for—" He stopped. Because they both knew, without finishing it, what that building was currently full of. Winter equipment. Stacked materials. Old timber framing from a renovation the previous fall. And as they watched, a woman came running from that direction. One of the women who lived nearby, a neighbor, and she was calling out in a way that had passed from alarmed into something worse. "There's someone inside," she was yelling. "A child. Tommy Marsh. He was playing in there. I saw him go in." The building's upper story gave a sound like a groan, and a section of the exterior wall moved, and Naomi, from where she sat in the doorway, could see the smoke pouring from every gap in the structure, and she could see the people gathering on the street in front of it, and she could see the absolute stillness that moved through them as they understood what they were looking at. Nobody was going in there. The wall was unstable. The smoke was dense. The structure was old and dry, and it had been burning long enough that nobody on their feet, nobody with the ordinary physical logic of self-preservation intact, was going to commit to that doorway without knowing they'd make it back out. Naomi was already moving. Caleb said her name. She heard it. She kept moving. She had the advantage of having looked at this building. She'd assessed it in March in the course of the structural review she'd done on several of Black Creek's older buildings. And she had its layout in her memory with the particular clarity of someone who files away structural information the way other people file away faces. 2 rooms on the ground level, a half loft above, exterior staircase on the eastern wall, interior access via a floor hatch. The hatch was the relevant information. The second floor was where the smoke was thickest, which meant the fire was advancing from below, and the boy, if he was in the loft, was still above it but wouldn't be for long. She crossed the street. The boardwalk ended at the corner and the ground was rough, and she took the worst of it on raw arm strength and forward momentum. Not smooth, nothing smooth about it, and she heard people making sounds around her. Surprise, a shout, someone saying don't. And she found the eastern wall of the building and followed it to the door because the eastern wall was the one with the least smoke coming from it, which meant the fire was running west to east. Caleb was behind her. She knew without looking. "If the floor's compromised," he started. "I know how the floor is built. I looked at this building." She was at the door. "I'll go in low. If the boy is in the loft, I need you to get the exterior ladder up to the loft access. Is there one? In the side alley? I don't know. Find out and get it there. She put enough certainty into it to cut through the smoke-sharpened fear. That's the exit route. I can navigate the inside, you get the ladder up. He went. She had maybe 30 seconds before her own better judgment caught up with her, so she used them. The interior was worse than the exterior had suggested. Smoke sat heavy at chest height on a standing person, which meant it was at her eye level, and she went as low as she could in the chair and pulled the collar of her coat up and moved fast along the floor where the air was thinnest. She knew the interior layout. Right side was clear floor, left was the old storage shelving, hatch to the loft was at the far wall center. She counted the distance from the door, 20 feet. She heard the boy before she saw him. A small sound, high and thin, from above. The loft. He was alive and he was up there, and he was scared in the way of children who've gone past crying into something smaller and worse. Tommy. She said it loud enough to carry over the fire's sound. Tommy Marsh, I'm coming up. Don't move. She reached the hatch. The ladder to it was a fixed iron bracket set, rungs bolted to the wall, running up to the loft opening. She'd noted this in March because it was structurally sensible in a way the rest of the building's aging frame was not. She wasn't going to climb those rungs. She couldn't climb those rungs. But she'd already known that, and she'd already been thinking about what she could do, which was different. Tommy, she said, directly below the hatch opening. Tommy, I need you to look down. Look down at me. A face appeared above her, smoke-smudged, red-eyed. I need you to come down the ladder, she said. I know the smoke is bad. I know you're scared. Come down the ladder, and when you get to me, I've got you. I will hold on. Can you do that? The face disappeared. A small sound. Then, a foot on the first rung. She positioned herself exactly below the hatch and put both hands up and braced everything she had. He came down fast when he came, with the panicked speed of a child who'd made the decision and didn't want to think about it, and he missed the last rung and dropped, and she caught him. She caught most of him, his weight landing across her arms and the chair back, and she held it, arms shaking, the chair rocking, and she did not let go. I've got you, she said. I've got you. Come on. She had him in her lap, and she turned and went back the way she'd come, along the eastern wall, counting distance in reverse, 20 feet. And the smoke was worse now, and the building was making sounds that told her the western section was losing its frame, and she moved as fast as the rough floor and the weight would allow. The door was there. The light was gray and cold and clean. Caleb was at the threshold. He grabbed the boy. The boy grabbed him back, hard, with the grip of someone who has decided not to let go of the first solid thing they've found. And Caleb pulled them both clear, and the building behind them made a sound like a long exhalation as something in its western frame came down. Naomi sat in the doorway and breathed. Her arms were still shaking. Her lungs were bad. She'd swallowed more smoke than she should have, and she knew she'd feel it for days. The boy was crying now, which was good, which meant he was past the stage of being too scared to cry. Around them, people had gathered, more than before, a crowd, and in it she could see faces she recognized. Vera, Mrs. Falk, Thayer, Briggs, the widow Tanner, and at the back of the crowd, hat in hand, standing slightly apart from the rest, Elias Holt. The rancher who had looked at her in a January square and said, I can't use a woman like that. She didn't look at him long. She looked at Tommy Marsh instead, who was being held by Caleb and was crying in the honest, released way of a child who's been terrified and is now, incrementally, not. You're all right, she said to him. You're all right. Her voice came out rougher than she'd expected, smoke scraped, and she cleared it and said it again. The building exhaled another section. Nobody was looking at it anymore. The smoke smell stayed in her hair for 3 days. She noticed it every morning when she woke. That specific heavy smell of old wood burning, different from a clean wood stove, carrying something darker in it. She didn't mind it exactly. It was a reminder that the thing had happened and she was still here, which was information worth having. Her lungs were rough for the first week. She coughed in the mornings and her voice stayed scraped and lower than usual, and Mrs. Falk made her a series of teas that smelled terrible and probably helped, and she drank them without complaint because Mrs. Falk made them with the brisk, unsentimental care of a woman who expressed concern through useful action, and Naomi understood that language. The town, meanwhile, was doing something she hadn't entirely anticipated. It wasn't that she'd expected nothing. She'd known the rescue would matter, the way visible acts always matter in small communities where people are watching each other and forming judgments in real time. But she'd expected the admiration to be complicated, hedged, the way admiration often is when it attaches to someone who makes people uncomfortable. She'd expected remarkable, considering. She'd expected impressive under the circumstances. The kind of praise that contains its own qualification. What she got instead was simpler than that, and harder to deflect. Carl the smith came to the shop 2 days after the fire. He came in the morning when she was working, and he set a piece of ironwork on her bench, a bracket, cleanly made, the kind she used regularly in her structural repairs, and said, "Made you a few, no charge." He looked at her for a moment with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has settled something in his own mind. "What you did was right." Then he left. Briggs stopped her on the street and shook her hand. He didn't elaborate. He shook it the way men do when they mean it and don't have better words, and she shook it back. Henry Marsh brought Tommy to see her. The boy was 9, and he'd been through something genuinely terrible, and he showed it in the way children sometimes show it, not in tears, which were mostly done, but in a clinging proximity to familiar things, a reluctance to be far from his father, who Naomi now knew was somewhere east and had been sent for. Henry was technically his uncle, which was why he'd been boarding in Black Creek. He stood in the doorway of the shop with his hands on Tommy's shoulders and said, "He wanted to come. I thought it would help." Tommy looked at the shop with the wide-eyed assessment of a child encountering a workshop for the first time. The tools, the workbench, the organized order of things that had purposes he didn't know yet. "What are you fixing?" he asked. "Gate hardware," Naomi said, "for a ranch outside town. The latch mechanism's worn down." "Can I watch?" "If you're quiet." He was quiet for almost 10 minutes, which for a 9-year-old was a significant achievement. When he finally spoke, he said, "Were you scared? In the building?" She considered the question honestly. "Yes, but you came in anyway." "I knew where the door was," she said, "and I knew how far back you were. When you know the structure, it's less—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Less unknown. And the unknown part is what's really scary." Tommy thought about this with the seriousness children apply to things they're actually working through rather than just asking about. "I didn't know the structure," he said. "No, you were the unknown part of the structure. That's the part I was scared about." He seemed satisfied with this answer in a way she hadn't expected. Henry looked at her over Tommy's head with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that seemed to contain something like gratitude and also something like the recognition of a complicated feeling. They stayed for another half hour. When they left, Tommy looked back once from the doorway, and she gave him a small nod, and he nodded back with great seriousness, and she thought, that one's going to be all right. The harder conversation came from an unexpected direction. It was 4 days after the fire, a Thursday afternoon, and she was outside the shop doing a measurement on the exterior wall, checking the fire damage to Caleb's building, planning what the repair would require, when she heard boots on the boardwalk and looked up to find Elias Holt. He stopped a few feet away. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd noticed men did when they were preparing to say something uncomfortable. It seemed to be a frontier custom. Hold the hat, it gives you something to do with your hands and signals that you've come with something, not nothing. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Holt." He looked at the scorched base of the exterior wall rather than at her, and she let him look. She had no particular need to make this easier for him. "I heard what you did," he said, "from about 6 different people by now, so I think I've got the full account." "All right." He turned the hat in his hands. He was a man of around 50, she thought, with the specific weathering of someone who'd spent decades doing physical work outdoors and had the body to show for it. Lean, strong in the shoulders, the kind of man who didn't have an ounce he hadn't earned. He wasn't unkind in his face. He was just a man who'd made a decision quickly, in public, without thinking it all the way through. "I said something in January that I shouldn't have said the way I said it," he said. "Or—" He stopped. Tried again. "I said it in front of people. That was wrong. Whatever I was trying to decide about my own situation, that wasn't anyone else's business, and I made it everyone's business, and I said things that were—" Another pause. "I underestimated you. I understood that before the fire, watching what you've done here. But I didn't say it then, so I'm saying it now." Naomi looked at him for a moment. She thought about January, the stage depot, the frozen ground, the crowd. I can't use a woman like that. The particular quality of that silence afterward, the children at the fence, her own effort to hold her face together while she turned and wheeled back to the platform. She also thought about the fact that she was still here, and he was standing in front of her with his hat in his hands, and that some portion of everything that had happened since January had been driven by the refusal to treat that moment as the final word on anything. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was acknowledgement. She thought that was what the situation actually called for, and she wasn't in the business of giving people more than a situation called for. He nodded. He seemed to understand the register of what she'd given him. "If you have work that needs doing, my ranch, the bunkhouse has a structural problem I haven't been able to solve, roof line shifting." He said it matter-of-factly, not as penance, which she respected more than if he'd made it sound like one. "I'd pay your rate." "I'll come look at it," she said. He put his hat back on and left. She looked at the scorched wall for another moment, then went back to measuring. Caleb found her that evening. He'd been to the sheriff's office, not for the first time since the fire, but this time he came back with something different in his face. He sat down at the work table and said, "The sheriff's moving." She set down her pencil. "He got a letter from the county," Caleb said, "about the documentation we sent. The county is opening a formal inquiry into the loan arrangements. The sheriff here has been asked to preserve documents and compel cooperation." He said it in the measured voice of a man reporting something he'd been waiting for and had nearly stopped believing would come. "And Dutch has been brought in for questioning about the fires." "Just Dutch?" "For now. But Dutch is not a man who holds silence when it costs him." His expression was complicated, not quite satisfied, because the thing wasn't finished, but something like the feeling of a weight shifting. "What does Pike know?" she asked. "He knows the county letter arrived. He was at the sheriff's office when the sheriff came back from the postal depot. Apparently, they crossed paths." "He knows." Caleb folded his hands on the table. "He went back to his store and hasn't come out since." She thought about Pike behind the walls of his mercantile, doing the same calculation she'd been doing, assessing the structure, finding the load-bearing points, understanding which ones had just been removed. She had some sympathy for the cognitive experience of it, if not for the man. "His attorney will be here inside of a week," she said. "Probably." "We need everything copied again, every document. I'll send a second packet to the county myself, independently of the sheriff." "Already making a list," he said. They worked that evening side by side, him copying documents in his careful hand, and her organizing them and cross-referencing each with the analysis she'd written, and it was work she knew well in its bones. The meticulous, unshowy work of building something that needed to hold under examination. She thought about her father, who'd spent his life building bridges and had told her once, "The inspection is part of the construction. You build it to be looked at, to be tested, not just to stand." These documents needed to stand. The week that followed moved at two speeds simultaneously. Slow in the daily texture of it, with the ordinary work of the shop and the lingering effects of smoke on her lungs, and fast in the way that events were stacking up underneath the surface. Dutch, she heard from Vera, was talking. He didn't know the full extent of the financial fraud, because Pike had not trusted him with that, but he knew about the fires. He'd been present for two of them and had helped set the second, and he was a man who valued his own freedom considerably more than his employer's interests. The sheriff had that information by Wednesday. By Thursday, two more of Pike's business partners had made quiet visits to the sheriff's office. Neither was Calloway. Calloway held out the longest out of the specific loyalty of a man who owes so much to someone that acknowledging the person's wrongdoing feels like acknowledging his own judgment's failure. But by Friday afternoon, Calloway was there too. Naomi heard about this from Vera, who heard it from the woman who cleaned the sheriff's office, who had the same useful invisibility as the woman who cleaned Pike's back room. He looked terrible, Vera said. Calloway, like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down and wasn't sure whether his back was going to hold or give out. "He'll be all right," Naomi said. She meant it. Calloway had been caught in the architecture of someone else's design. and now that the design was being dismantled, he was just a man with a wagon business and an overstated debt. What are the terms on his loan, actually? Do you know? The widow Tanner's attorney, she found one in Laramie, she's been busy, was looking at it yesterday. He thinks the recoverable overpayment might cancel most of what Callaway has outstanding. Vera said it with the quiet pleasure of a woman who believes in correctly functioning systems. Not all, but most. The attorney from Laramie arrived on Saturday, and he was not Pike's attorney but the widow Tanner's, a compact, efficient man named Soren who wore spectacles and had the air of someone who had seen several versions of this situation before and had developed views on it. He set up in the widow Tanner's shop on Saturday afternoon and received people. He was there until 9 in the evening. Naomi did not go. She was not directly implicated in the financial arrangements, and there was nothing she could formally add to what the others were saying. What she had was the analysis she'd written, which she sent via Henry Marsh with a note explaining it, and Soren sent back a brief reply. Thorough and clearly explained. Thank you. She kept working. She finished the gate hardware for the ranch outside town. She assessed the shifting roofline at Holt's bunkhouse. It was a lateral brace issue, solvable but not simple, and quoted the job and scheduled it for the following week. She repaired a window sash in the schoolhouse that had been letting cold air in all winter, which Henry mentioned with such obvious relief that she almost felt guilty for not having gotten to it sooner. In the middle of all this, Pike's attorney arrived. He came from Laramie on Tuesday's stage, and he was the opposite of Soren in almost every way. Large where Soren was compact, loud where Soren was quiet, dressed in a way that said he considered himself the most important person in any room he entered. His name was Breck, and he went directly from the stage to Pike's Mercantile and was in there for the better part of 3 hours. What came out of those 3 hours by Wednesday morning was an approach Naomi had half anticipated. Breck circulated through the relevant businesses arguing that the agreements were standard, that the terminology was industry normal, that what looked like discrepancy was in fact the result of misunderstanding on the part of signatories who had received what they signed up for. He did not say this to Naomi directly. He said it to Callaway, to Briggs, and apparently to the sheriff, who listened without visible reaction and then sent a second letter to the county. Vera came in Thursday morning with the specific expression of someone who has information that is both good and requires some explanation. Breck came to see me, she said. Naomi looked up. You? Why? Because I'm the oldest established business in town, and he wanted to know whether I had signed any agreements with Pike, and whether I'd be willing to speak to the, I think the word he used was groundless, nature of these complaints. Vera sat down on the stool Caleb had left in Naomi's section. I told him I had not signed anything with Pike. I also told him that I had watched the entire trajectory of the past 4 months with considerable attention, and that in my assessment the complaints were not groundless in any way I could identify. What did he say? He said it was unfortunate that certain newcomers had introduced instability into what had been a well-functioning community. She said it with the precision of direct quotation. I told him that what had been well-functioning was mostly the arrangement by which Gideon Pike was making more money than he deserved at the expense of people who had trusted him. Naomi looked at her. You said that. I'm 63 years old, Vera said. I've earned the right to say what I think. The county's formal inspector arrived the following Thursday. He was a quiet, methodical man from Cheyenne named Aldridge, who asked to see every document, took careful notes, and said very little to anyone beyond what was necessary for his work. He was in Black Creek for 4 days. He interviewed the widow Tanner, Briggs, Callaway, Thayer, the sheriff, and Caleb. He asked to see Naomi's written analysis, which she provided along with the supporting calculations, and he sat with it for a long time and asked her 3 specific questions about her methodology, which she answered. On his last morning, he stopped by the shop. He looked at the sign, the relettered one, chiseled deep, for a moment before he came in. I understand you were the one who first identified the systematic discrepancy, he said. Caleb Reed's wife identified it first, Naomi said. I was the one who could do the arithmetic to demonstrate it clearly. He nodded. He had the considered quality of a man who heard a lot of people's versions of events and had developed a sense for when he was getting the accurate one. The documentation is solid, he said. I won't tell you what the outcome will be. That's not my determination to make, but the documentation is solid. That's what I was trying to build, she said. He looked at her for a moment, at the shop, the tools, the workbench. You do structural repair, he said. Primarily. The county building in Cheyenne has a floor that's been problematic for 2 years. If you're ever looking to expand your territory. He said it without a smile, but with the matter-of-fact quality of a man who evaluates competence and responds to it. I'll keep that in mind, she said. He tipped his hat and left. She sat with the quiet of that for a moment. The shop was warm. She'd finally solved the drafting problem in the corner, a matter of a sealed gap in the wall-floor junction that had been bleeding cold air all spring. And the sun was coming through the window at the late morning angle that put a stripe of light across the workbench. She looked at the light on the bench and thought, 4 months ago you were sitting in a stageway station in the cold wondering if you'd made an irreversible mistake. And then she picked up the gate latch she was finishing and went back to work because the thought was complete and the work was in front of her. What happened to Pike unfolded not in a single dramatic moment, but in the way things actually collapse, incrementally, then all at once. The county's formal finding arrived by post 2 weeks after Aldridge's visit. It was addressed to the sheriff, and the contents were not made public in an official way, but in a town the size of Black Creek, the relevant information moved through the air with the efficiency of something that has been waiting for permission to circulate. What it established: systematic overcharging on 11 financing agreements over a 7-year period, amounting to a total recoverable sum that made Calloway sit down in the middle of the hardware store when he heard the number. Dutch was charged separately in connection with the fires, which meant the arson piece was also on the record. Breck left on the next stage south. He left without visible drama, which was itself informative. If he'd had a real case to make, he'd have stayed to make it. Pike closed his mercantile for 2 days. When it reopened, he was there, working, but the quality of his presence had changed. Naomi had not spoken to him directly in all the months she'd been in Black Creek, and she still did not. She saw him from across the street once, a Thursday morning, her on her way to Holt's Ranch for the bunkhouse job, and she looked and he looked, and there was a moment of mutual, unadorned acknowledgement before she kept going. She thought about what Vera had said. He built his position on being the person people came to when they needed something they couldn't get anywhere else. That position required the belief that he was the only option. Once people knew there were other options and that the existing option had been costing them more than they knew, the position couldn't hold. It wasn't a dramatic fall. It was more like a structure that had lost its load-bearing function. It stood for a while, and then it didn't. The businesses that had operated under his credit arrangements began the slow work of renegotiating or settling. The widow Tanner's attorney was useful here. He'd seen this kind of situation before, and he knew the pathways through it, and several of the affected businesses engaged him on their own account. Calloway's arrangement settled first, because the numbers were clearest and the overpayment was most substantial, and because Calloway had been first to the sheriff's office once he went, which Soren had made sure to document. Caleb watched all of this with the steady, careful attention he applied to most things. One evening in late May, sitting in the shop while she worked on a window frame for the schoolhouse edition, he said, "My wife would have appreciated this, the way it came out." She looked at him. He was not sad when he said it, exactly. Or he was, but it was the kind of sadness that coexists with other things, that's been lived with long enough to find its place. "Tell me about her," Naomi said. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought maybe she'd asked something she shouldn't have. But then he started talking. He talked for a long time. Sarah, her name had been, and she'd come to Black Creek as a teacher before the school had a proper building, and she'd held sessions in the laundry on Saturdays before Henry Marsh arrived. She'd been funny, he said, in the dry way of someone who'd grown up with brothers and learned to hold her own. She'd been particular about numbers, not obsessive, just accurate, careful, the way some people are about language. She'd started keeping books for the local businesses because she was good at it, and because the extra income was useful, and because she liked knowing how things worked. She found the Pike discrepancy by accident, Caleb said. She was reconciling Thayer's account 1 month and the interest computation didn't match her records from the previous quarter. She thought she'd made an error. She went back 3 times before she understood it wasn't her. She must have been angry, Naomi said. She was. He smiled slightly. She was very controlled about it. She said, "I'm going to understand this fully before I do anything." And then she got sick. He looked at his hands. She never got to the doing anything part. She got to the understanding it part, Naomi said. That's what we used. That's what made everything else possible. He was quiet for a moment, then, I know. The window frame was nearly done. She set it on the bench and tested the mechanism. Clean, no binding, smooth through the full range. She thought about Sarah Reed, who'd been precise with numbers and funny with brothers, who'd held school in a laundry on Saturdays, who'd found something wrong and started building the evidence to demonstrate it, and then run out of time. She did the first part, Naomi said. We finished it. It was something, and they both knew it, and they sat with it. June came in warm, and the town shifted again with the season. Lighter, more expansive, the way frontier towns are in summer when the worst of the year is past. And there's enough light in the evenings to do things outside. Naomi's work expanded with the weather. Exterior work, structural assessments on buildings that needed their winter damage evaluated and addressed. The bunkhouse job at Holt's Ranch, which turned out to be more involved than she'd anticipated and kept her busy for 2 weeks. She liked working at the ranch. The open space, the quality of the light, the way the mountains sat at the edge of everything without demanding attention, just present, permanent, indifferent in the good way. Holt's men watched her work with the unself-conscious curiosity of people who'd never seen this specific combination of person and task before and after. The first 2 days they stopped watching and just went about their own work, which meant they'd categorized her as a normal part of the landscape, which was what she'd always been trying to achieve. Holt himself was a better man than January, she thought, or he'd always been this man and January had just been him at his worst, which was a distinction that mattered. He paid her fairly, communicated clearly about what he needed, and left her alone to do it. On the last day of the bunkhouse job, when the roof line was corrected and the lateral bracing was set, and she'd stayed an extra half hour doing a final assessment of the overall structure, he brought her a cup of coffee and stood beside her looking at the building. Good work, he said. Thank you. I mean that. He held the coffee cup with both hands, looking at the bunkhouse with the quiet satisfaction of a man seeing something fixed that had been wrong. I've been watching you think through problems. It's not... I don't know what I expected, but it's not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about it. Someone trying harder to prove something, all the time, like every job was an argument. It would be exhausting, she said. You're just... He struggled with it slightly, which she appreciated. The struggling meant he was actually trying to say it accurately. You're just doing the work. That's the whole thing, she said. That's the entirety of it, just doing the work. He nodded. It seemed to settle something for him that had needed settling. On the ride back to town, she hired a wagon for tool transport on the bigger jobs, driven by a taciturn young man named Dale, who had never asked her a single personal question and remained her favorite hired driver. She sat with the late afternoon light and thought about the past 6 months. Not with any particular sentiment, just taking inventory the way she did with her tools. What was here? What was solid? What had changed? She had a shop. She had a sign that nobody had touched in 2 months. She had a ledger with 43 jobs recorded in it and a 44th in progress, and a Cheyenne contact who'd sent her 2 referrals. She had Vera, who was the closest thing she'd had to a friend in years. And she had Henry Marsh, who was improving, and she had the widow Tanner, who had sent her a thank you note in handwriting as precise as a surveyor's line. She had Caleb. She let herself think about that plainly, without deflection, which she hadn't entirely permitted herself before. She had Caleb Reed, who had made space in his building and his life with the particular lack of ceremony of a man who didn't see why ceremony was necessary for the right decision, who had left a lamp on for her without being asked, who had gone around the back of a burning building to find a ladder while she went in the front door, who had talked about his wife with the open, unguarded quality of someone who had decided that grief and present life could share the same house. She thought, something is happening there and you know it, and you should probably stop pretending you don't. Then she thought, you can think about that when you get back. The wagon pulled onto Main Street as the sun was getting long. The storefronts threw shadows across the boardwalk. She could see from the end of the street the laundry building, her sign on the bracket Caleb had made, N. Hartwell, repair and engineering, catching the last of the direct light in a way that made it legible from a distance. Something happened in her chest that she didn't try to name. She had been, all her life since the accident, since the day the scaffold had given way on her father's job site, and she'd been 22 years old, and the world had reconstituted itself into before and after, in the project of finding out what after looked like, what it could be made to look like, with enough determination and the right tools and the willingness to go through the door that was available rather than waiting for the door she'd lost. She had not known in January whether Black Creek was the right door. She had not been certain for months. There were days she still wasn't, not entirely, because certainty was for people who hadn't had enough happen to them yet. But she was here. She was here. And she was working, and the sign was readable from the end of the street, and the bunkhouse was solid, and the widow Tanner had gotten some of her money back, and Tommy Marsh was all right. Dale stopped the wagon in front of the laundry, and she climbed down with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. And Caleb appeared in the doorway of the laundry at the sound of the wagon, and he looked at her across the small distance of the boardwalk, with an expression she had been cataloging over months of evenings and had never fully named. "How'd it go?" he said. "Good," she said. "How was the laundry?" "Still laundry," he said, which was not particularly funny, but she laughed a little anyway, the rough quality of it still in her voice from the smoke 3 weeks ago. He came down to help with the toolkit, and for a moment they were occupied with the ordinary logistics of it, the weight and the placement, the brief negotiation of who carries what. And in that ordinary moment, with the summer evening light on the street and the smell of the town around them and the sign above readable in both directions, she thought, This is what after looks like. Not perfect, not finished by a long reach, but real, and hers, and worth the distance she'd traveled to find it. The evening after the bunkhouse job, they ate dinner together at Mrs. Falk's table for the first time. Not by arrangement exactly, but because Caleb had walked her back and Mrs. Falk had appeared in the doorway and said, with the calm authority of a woman who managed her household like a small country, that there was enough for 3 and he might as well sit down. He sat down. Mrs. Falk served them roast and potatoes and a vegetable that had come from somewhere south and was still a minor miracle in Wyoming in June. And she talked about the couple who'd passed through that morning on their way to the Oregon Territory with 2 small children and a wagon that had clearly been packed by someone who hadn't done it before. She talked about this with the detached, informational quality of someone who observed human nature as a hobby and had opinions about it. Caleb listened and Naomi listened, and occasionally one of them said something and Mrs. Falk responded and then continued. It was, Naomi thought, the most ordinary thing that had happened to her in Black Creek. After dinner, when Mrs. Falk had retreated to her sitting room with her mending, and the table had been cleared with the practical efficiency of a household where everyone knew their part, Caleb sat with a second cup of coffee, and Naomi sat across from him, and the lamp between them was the same lamp that had been burning in Caleb's laundry on all those late evenings, or felt like it. "I've been thinking about the building," he said. "Which part?" "The part that's yours." He turned the cup in both hands. That habit. The one she'd cataloged without meaning to. "You've been renting that corner for 5 months. You've made it into something real." "I've been trying to." "You have. It's not trying anymore. It's done." He paused. "I want to extend the arrangement, make it more permanent, and I want to... There's a section along the south wall that I haven't been using for anything. If you wanted to expand, take that space, build a proper workshop, I think the work you're doing is going to outgrow the corner." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Some weeks, yes." "What made you say it tonight?" He considered the question with his usual unhurried honesty. "Because you came back from Holt's Ranch and you looked like someone who'd done exactly the right thing and knew it. And I thought, she's building something here. I want to be part of building it with her." The lamp held. Outside, the summer evening sounds of Black Creek came through the window. Voices at a distance, a horse, the particular way a frontier town settles into its nighttime rhythm. She said, "I want that too." They held each other's gaze for a moment, and there was something in the air that had been building for months, and that neither of them had been willing to name before now, not out of dishonesty, but because they were both people who had been hurt by naming things too quickly and knew the value of letting something be certain before you said it out loud. Now it was certain enough. She could feel that, and she thought he could too. "I should say something else," he said. "All right." He set down the coffee cup. "I've been thinking about, not the business arrangement, the other part." He seemed to be choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully, because he meant them. I know this has been... He stopped. I'm not good at this, he said, with the directness of a man abandoning a failed approach. Neither am I, she said, which was true. You've changed things here, not just the Pike situation, not just the work. You've... He looked at her. I didn't expect to feel like this again. About anyone. I'd mostly decided I wouldn't. She thought about the first evening at the laundry, fixing the ringer mechanism with him working nearby, his offer of space made so matter-of-factly, his wife's papers in the cloth bundle. She thought about all the evenings since, the accumulated weight of time spent with someone who didn't require her to perform any version of herself, who'd watched her think through problems and hadn't tried to solve them for her. I didn't expect it either, she said. I came here for something different. I came here to build a life, and I thought I knew what shape I wanted it to have, and it didn't include... She paused. I'd been practical about certain things for a long time. Practical in a way that was also a little bit giving up. You're not giving up now, he said. No, she agreed. I'm not. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and they sat like that for a moment. Not dramatic, not performed, just two people who had arrived at something true and were acknowledging it without making too large a ceremony of it. Mrs. Falk appeared briefly in the doorway, and then disappeared again with the tact of a woman who had seen this sort of thing before and knew when not to be present. Naomi almost laughed. You're going to have to say it plainly, she told him. I don't do well with things that are left understood. He did laugh at that. A real laugh, not a polite one. I love you, he said. Is that plain enough? That's plain enough, she said. The south wall space was cleared by the end of June. Caleb did most of the heavy clearing himself, which took 2 days. And she organized the rearrangement of the storage that had been displaced, which took another day. And by the first week of July, she had a space roughly 3 times the size of her original corner, with natural light from 2 windows and enough floor clearance to work on large pieces. She designed the workshop herself. Not in an elaborate way. She wasn't building a cathedral, but with the same attention she gave to any structural project, thinking about the work that needed to happen in each part of the space, what access would serve it best, what the flow of materials in and out looked like. She drew it in her notebook, revised it twice, walked it in the empty room before she committed to anything. Carl the Smith helped her build the main bench. It was a significant undertaking, solid oak top, 4 inches thick, built to take the kind of lateral force that benchwork generates. And Carl brought 2 pieces of his own ironwork that made it better than what she'd designed. Corner brackets with a particular angle that distributed load more efficiently, and a vise mounting that she'd have specified differently and would have been wrong to. She told him so, and he shrugged with the satisfaction of a man who knows he's made something well. Your design was fine, he said. Mine's better. Your vise mounting is better, she said. My layout is better. Fair, he said. They were both right. The bench went in on a Thursday, and she sat at it that evening after Carl had left, just sitting with her hands on the surface of it. The oak was clean and tight-grained, and it smelled like wood and iron and possibility, which was a combination she'd loved since she was young enough to follow her father around job sites. She ran her thumb along the edge and thought about him. Not with grief, exactly. The grief had moved through its different seasons and was something calmer now, more like respect. Thought about what he'd made of her by letting her watch and by coming back to tell her what she'd done wrong, and by handing her a box of tools on a Christmas morning when she was 15. She thought, you didn't get to see this, but you built the part of me that made it. In August, the county's formal ruling on the Pike matter arrived. It was not a criminal conviction. That process would take longer and might not go all the way, depending on what Breck's arguments could accomplish at the state level. But what the ruling established was clear and legally binding. The interest overcharges were fraudulent under the terms of the agreements, the affected parties were entitled to recovery, and Pike was required to produce his full account records for review. The total recovery figure, when Soren calculated it with the Widow Tanner's papers and the other accounts, was a number that produced silence in several people when they heard it. Calloway sat down again when he heard it. He'd apparently made a habit of this, but this time he sat down in Naomi's shop, where he'd come to tell her the news because Vera had told him she should hear it from someone in person. And after a moment of sitting, he looked up at her and said, I want to apologize to you. She was fitting a hinge and she kept working. You don't need to. I think I do. He was a large man, and he took up considerable space on the stool, and he was clearly not comfortable doing this, but was doing it anyway, which she respected. I saw what Pike was doing to you, turning people against you, the things Dutch was saying, and I didn't say anything. I had reasons, good ones, I thought, but I know what I saw, and I know what I did about it. She looked at him then. He met it, which was its own kind of answer. Calloway, she said, you came to me when your pipe burst and you paid me fairly. You came to the sheriff when it cost you something to do it. You're not the villain of this. I'm not the hero of it either. Most people aren't the hero of anything, she said. They're just people trying to navigate a situation. You navigated yours badly for a while, and then you navigated it better. That's the whole story for most of us. He was quiet for a moment, and she went back to the hinge. That's a generous view, he said. I've had reason to develop one, she said. He left, and she thought about what she'd said to him, and whether she'd meant it, and she had. She'd arrived in Black Creek with a particular chip on her shoulder. She knew it, she'd always known it, the specific defensive sharpness of someone who'd been underestimated too many times and had learned to present a surface that didn't invite it. Some of that was necessary. Some of it had calcified into something that kept people at a distance she didn't actually want them at. She'd lost some of that calcification somewhere in the past 8 months. She wasn't sure exactly when. She thought it might have been the pump at Gorman's, or the ringer mechanism at the laundry, or the night they put out the fire at the back wall. Some moment in the accumulated work of being present and useful in a place until the place accepted you. Not completely, not without reservation, but enough. Enough was always the measure that mattered. Pike left Black Creek in September. He didn't leave dramatically. There was no scene, no confrontation, no last conversation with anyone Naomi knew. He sold the mercantile to a consortium that included, in a strange turn of events she appreciated for its structural neatness, Calloway and Thayer and the Mills accounting man, who'd always been too careful with money to have signed anything he didn't understand. The new arrangement was simpler and more transparent, which was all anyone had wanted from the beginning. Dutch had a hearing before the county court in Laramie. He received a sentence that was lighter than it should have been, as sentences often are, but it included time served and a period of supervised presence that meant he wouldn't be in Black Creek for the foreseeable future. Naomi heard about it from the sheriff, who told her with the flat, honest resignation of a man who has learned not to expect full satisfaction from legal processes. It's not nothing, the sheriff said. No, she agreed. It's not nothing. She'd spent enough years working on real structures to know that the difference between nothing and something was enormous, and that something rarely looked as good as what you'd planned for. You adjusted. You found what was there, and you built from it. The autumn came in with its particular light, lower, more amber, the mountains going from gray-green to gray-gold, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in a week. She'd been through one winter in Black Creek already, and she had a better sense now of what to prepare for, what the building needed before the cold came back, what her own habits required to get through the dark months without losing momentum. She expanded the stove installation in the workshop, which had been inadequate the previous winter. She ordered materials for 3 jobs that needed to be completed before the ground froze. She spent a week in October assessing the structural conditions of the older buildings on Main Street, this time officially commissioned by the new Mercantile Consortium, who wanted a proper record, and produced a written report that the county building office in Cheyenne requested a copy of, which led to a brief correspondence with Aldridge, who had apparently not forgotten about the county building floor. She wrote back. She kept the tone professional. She thought about Cheyenne and what it would mean and whether it was possible, and set the question aside for later, which was where she kept things that weren't yet actionable. Caleb proposed to her on a Thursday. It was not a dramatic occasion. They were both in the laundry, both working late in the afternoon in October with the light going outside and the stove doing its work and the smell of warm, clean linen that she'd come to associate with those evenings more than any other smell. She was finishing a diagram for the Cheyenne correspondence, and he was going over his accounts, and he looked up from his accounts and said, "Will you marry me?" He said it without the interrogative lilt, which was not grammatically a question, but was the most genuine version of the sentence, the one that didn't require the voice to rise at the end because it wasn't hedging. She looked up from the diagram. He held her gaze. He was slightly nervous. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The way he'd put down his pen very precisely on the table, but he wasn't performing the nervousness. He was just a man who'd said a true thing and was waiting to find out what she thought about it. She thought several things in quick succession. That she loved him, that she'd known for months, that she was better at being certain about structures than about people, but that in this case she was certain about both. She thought about the measuring rod her father had given her. She thought about January, the stage depot, the frozen square. I can't use a woman like that. She thought, look at what you built from that. Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. He exhaled, a small, controlled exhale that was the understatement of a man who'd been holding more tension than he'd shown. Obviously, he said. I'm not good at uncertainty, she said. I've been certain about this for a while. How long is a while? She considered it. The evening you came to my room with the ringer problem, she said. You knocked and explained what you needed and didn't look at the chair and didn't not look at it either. You just said what you needed. I thought, that's a person who sees things correctly. He smiled. The full version of it, which she'd learned was rarer than the partial version and therefore worth more. That's a low bar, he said. It shouldn't be, she said. But it is. That's just the truth of it. They were married in November before the deepest cold came back, in a small ceremony at the widow Tanner's shop because it was the largest indoor space with a level floor and good light, and because the widow Tanner had offered it with such matter-of-fact decisiveness that refusing had not seemed like a real option. Vera organized most of the details because Vera organized things. It was her nature and her pleasure, and she did it with efficiency and without excessive decoration. The people who came, Vera, Mrs. Falk, Henry Marsh with Tommy. Tommy's father had arrived in September and Tommy had gone home with him, but they'd all come back for this, which Naomi found more moving than she'd anticipated. Carl the Smith, whose presence was solid and comfortable like something structural. Thayer, who brought his wife, who Naomi had met only twice, but who had a laugh that took up the whole room. Briggs, who shook Caleb's hand with the same serious conviction he'd shaken Naomi's. The widow Tanner herself, who wore a dark dress and stood very straight and gave Naomi a look when they stood together for a moment that said, we are two people who have handled difficult things, and now we are also something else, and that is a fine situation. Holt came. He stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and he nodded at Naomi when she caught his eye across the room, and she nodded back. And it was enough, more than enough, the right size for what it was. The ceremony was short because they'd both asked for it to be short, and after it was done and the room had moved into the easier territory of conversation and the food Vera had arranged, Naomi sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and just looked at the room. She was looking for the feeling of arrival she'd expected, the completed project feeling, the sense of a thing finished and secured. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something more complicated and more honest. The awareness that this was not a finish line, that it was more like the end of a foundation, the point at which you have something solid enough to build the next thing on. She thought about what it meant, everything she'd done and not done, the road from Billings and the 11 days in the way station and the January square and the pump at Gorman's and the ringer and the scratch marks on her sign and the papers in the cloth bundle and the fire and the building and the boy and all of it, all the accumulated weight and work of it. Here's what she thought, sitting in the widow Tanner's shop with the sound of people she'd come to know around her. Nobody gives you a place in the world. You can wait for that and it will not come. The people who seem to have been given it, who look like the world was arranged to receive them, if you look closely enough, you'll find the work underneath. The unglamorous, incremental, often humiliating work of showing up and being useful and getting back up when someone tells you, publicly, in a frozen square in January, that they can't use you. The world does not adjust itself to your presence. You adjust to it, and then you change it, and then it adjusts to you. In that order, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks that feel permanent until they don't. She'd come to Black Creek because she had no better option, and she'd stayed because she'd refused to let humiliation be the last word. And she'd built something not because she was exceptional, but because she'd been willing to stay in the room when it would have been easier to leave. Staying in the room is underrated. It is the whole of it sometimes. She'd also had help. She wanted to be honest about that. Carl in his brackets. Vera and her 4 times daily circulation of the relevant information. Mrs. Falk and her terrible tea and her tact. The widow Tanner and her clear handwriting and her contained fury, Briggs and his wagon axle. Tommy Marsh, who had come down a ladder in a burning building because she'd told him she had him, and she'd meant it, and he'd known she meant it. And Caleb, who had left a lamp on, who had made space, who had held the ladder, who had said he wasn't right. She was looking at him now, across the room, talking to Thayer, easy in the way of a man who'd found his footing after years of being slightly off balance. And he looked back at her as if he'd felt the attention, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been cataloging for months, and could now simply name: love and recognition and the specific contentment of someone who has done the right thing and is standing in the evidence of it. She raised her coffee cup slightly, and he raised his. Vera appeared at her elbow. "You need to eat something," she said. "You've been sitting here philosophizing. Is it that obvious? You get a particular look." Vera pressed a plate into her hands. "Eat. Philosophize later." She ate. The winter came back, as Wyoming winters do, without apology or warning. The first hard snow came in late November, and the town went into its contracted, warm-seeking winter mode, and Naomi worked in the shop with the improved stove doing its job and the new bench solid under her work. She took jobs that could be done indoors: mechanisms, furniture repair, the detailed ironwork that was too fine for Carl's scale of operation. She took one job from Cheyenne by correspondence, an engineering assessment for a public building that she completed from plans and written description and posted back, and received payment that was more substantial than anything she'd made in a single transaction in Black Creek. She didn't tell many people about the Cheyenne work. She was still thinking about what it meant, whether it was a direction or just an event. Caleb knew. Aldridge had asked if she'd be willing to be listed as a regional consultant for the county's building office, which was not a formal position, but was a recognition, and she'd said she'd think about it. She was thinking about it. What she knew was this: she was not done. Whatever she'd built in Black Creek was real, and she wasn't leaving it. Wasn't leaving the shop, wasn't leaving Caleb, wasn't leaving the particular satisfaction of work that was needed by people she'd come to know. But she was also not going to pretend that the ceiling of what she'd arrived expecting was the ceiling of what was possible. She'd already exceeded it by a considerable margin. The question was how much higher the actual ceiling was. She didn't have the answer yet. That was fine. She'd learned over the course of a year that had taken her from a stage platform in January to this, that not having the answer yet was just the beginning of the next problem to solve. And she'd always been good at problems. In December, she expanded the sign, not dramatically, just the bracket, made wider, and the lettering made larger and clearer, and below her name, below repair and engineering, a second line: structural assessment and design. Because that was true now. Because she'd been doing it, and it was time for the sign to say what the work actually was. She chiseled it herself, deep into the wood, the way she'd re-lettered her name after the scratch marks, so it would hold, so it would take effort to remove, so it would be readable from the end of the street, even in the thin winter light. Caleb came out and looked at it when she was done. "Good," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "Both things," he said. She looked at the sign, at her name and what it had come to mean in this place, at the letters she'd cut with her own hands. And then she looked at the street, at Black Creek going about its December business around them, and she felt the thing she felt every time she finished a piece of work she was proud of. Not the grand swelling emotion of stories, but the quieter, truer satisfaction of a thing done right. A thing that will hold. A thing that is, as far as she can make it, good. She had come here broken, or so they'd thought. She had come here with a toolbox and a wheelchair and the residue of a humiliation that was supposed to be final. She had come here, and she had stayed, and she had built. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.